that this is the slide deck that you'll go to when you need to start, if you need to use Pymongo, or even if you need to use Mongo in a container in Docker. So anyway, these are the slides you can use. They're really all the other stuff we had before, where these are all the notes we've gone through, where we've been installing the database or the data, the file system for Mongo and everything else. And so we have everything really in these slides. But the actual thing that I wanted to talk about, though, before we actually go through these slides, is if you'll come with me to CS Allegheny EDU, and we need to mention that on Wednesday we have our exam coming up. We'll get back to the slides in a minute here. Databases, if you go to the planning your time, I hope this should not be a surprise to anybody here. We've been talking about this exam 2 for some time. This is actually it's going to be given on the 11th here, that's a Wednesday. I'm thinking that next class, Wednesday class, we'll have, I'll just give out the test at that time. At the beginning of class, I mean, we're not having a formal meeting, but I'll just put the test out there, and you can work on it during class, and you can work on it whenever you want. You'll have you'll have more than 24 hours to complete this. And what I mean by that is, this is actually it's not 24 hours, I think it's 27 hours. Because I'm asking you to submit this after the lab, on Thursday the next day. So you have you'll have a bunch of time. So you'll have class time, you'll have the lab time, and you'll have hours the following day. Now, the reason why all this time is not because this is going to be a difficult exam. It's not going to be a difficult exam, I don't think, unless if you've been paying attention and coming to class and looking over the notes and you understand the conceptual stuff that we've been going through. Then I do not believe it's really a difficult thing. But remember, though, that you do have colleagues in this class who are in different time zones, and so giving the exam at lab time could be midnight for them, and that's just not fair. So I'm not sticking to I'm just giving you this big area of time, this big window of time in which you can take this test. Which also means, though, that I don't really care how much time it takes you to take the test, just as long as you get it done. As long as it's actually done by the time that it's supposed to be due. And when is that time? Well, if we come back to the slides, which is what we were pulling earlier here, it's right here, exam 2. We have, for instance, it's going to be given out on Wednesday the 11th. That's at 11:30, that's class time. That's of this week here, next class. And it's to be completed by Thursday the 12th at 3 p.m. And so that's 27 hours of time, and I think that in that time, it will be convenient for everybody in this course to take the exam. And of course, the exam is going to be open notes, open book, all that stuff, because it's take home. And I'm not going to have a proctor follow you home and sit with you while you're taking this exam, because that's just silly. But still, it's going to be conceptual stuff. It's going to be very similar, actually, to the last test that you had in this class. I mean, almost exactly the same kind of format. Again, lab material is not on this test. The test covers the stuff we covered in class, not the stuff we covered in lab. And so you do not need to worry about lab material. But really what we're going to be doing in this test here is you're going to be spending a lot of time writing queries, actually kind of going through and kind of dissecting what it is that makes a Mongo query work. And so what I'm saying is that if you want to study for this, you can start by practicing your queries for Mongo. Now, we also have some Python for simple automation, and by that I mean Pymongo. Discuss the concepts. Why do we care about using automation? Why do we care about using Python? Isn't Mongo already making things complicated enough? Do we have to add more computer science to this? Yes, we do, because Mongo is really one of those databases languages which has been designed really to be used by other machines. I mean, the output is it just seems to work very well. For machines, it's not very user-friendly in terms of writing queries, and so it makes sense that you'd want to use Mongo with some kind of programming language. Also, let's see, we have some basic Django setup. We did spend a lot of time doing Django, and so I think that I really have to add some questions about Django onto this test. But it's not going to be asking, none of these questions are going to be asking you to write code. I'm not going to ask you to write code. Because you can look that up. I can look up the code. I think it's more important to know kind of that the code is, or maybe how do you run the code, or how do you make use of some of the some of the code here. But the actual syntax of the code, I'm not going to ask you that. I'll just make you look at the. I'm asking more or less about which pieces of code to run, but I'm going to, and then by that I would assume that you know the code. But for here though, for the basic Django setup, when I'm talking about the code, I'm actually talking about like the different files that you have to run, like which. What is the urls.py file? What does that do? How do I incorporate that into my project? And so it's like setting up the project, which is exactly what we did in this class, just setting up the project. Let's see, then we have like short answers over concepts. These are, again, not writing queries, not looking at code, but more or less just discussing why you would do something the way that you do. Why do we use MongoDB when we already have SQL? I mean, why change the database? And so this is one of those kind of conceptual questions that you would have to answer. And so I'm thinking that you'll probably have maybe 3 or 4 perhaps conceptual questions, which will be at the beginning of the test, and everything else then would after that will be multiple choice, matching, and maybe some other short answer questions. But it's that kind of test. So in other words, it's very similar to the test that we had last time. Are there any questions over this before we move on to something else? Remember that you in class, what I'm going to do is we're not actually going to have a formal meeting, but I'll put out the test. It will come out on Sakai, so that when you first come to class or when you first log in, you can pick up your test at that time, or you can take your test later on. But as long as your test is done by Thursday the 12th at 3, then that's okay. So one more thing I'll mention is that is the due date for the test, Thursday the 12th at 3 p.m. But let me just say that don't wait until Thursday the 12th at 2:30 p.m. to start doing your test, because you will not finish. There's no excuse for that. You have so much time as it is. You may as well use this time to your advantage. I believe in other classes they say that your exam times don't change and you still get 2 hours or whatever it is. But I mean, I'm not interested in the amount of time that it takes for people to think for these tests, but rather I'm interested in the actual answers of the tests themselves, because I think that is where the strength is, the answers or the solutions, rather than the speed that it takes to actually reach those. Yes, ma'am. Yes. So I'm saying that we won't have class on Wednesday. So that means that if I'm giving out the test, that means that when you first at 11:30, when you first log into the class, you can actually, we're not actually having a formal meeting. There's no material. The test will just be released at that time on Sakai's, what's it called, tests and quizzes. So yes, so I guess there's no formal meeting on Wednesday. Yeah. Are there any other questions at all? So no meeting on Wednesday. Just log into Sakai whenever you can and take your exam 2. It should be there, and you'll see it coming out at 11:30 on the 11th of November. But that doesn't mean that you have to take it at 11:30. You can take it anytime you want, as long as you have plenty of time, as long as you give yourself plenty of time so that it can actually be completed and handed in by the 12th at 3. I hope that's fair. Are there any other questions? Okay. Anyway, as you're taking this test, though, I mean, I'll still be available on Slack. I don't want to just make you feel that you have to, you're sitting there by yourself, and I'm kind of, skipping off to some, some I don't know, vacation place, or whatever it is, going to Hawaii while you're taking this thing and just relaxing. No. I will still be available on Slack. So if you have any questions, you can reach me on Slack. Okay, I think that's cool. We have a practical 4 here, but before we get to that, I want to show you some code here, just because I think it's actually very, very cool. And so I wanted to show you. Let's go back to our. If I can find it here. Let's go back to our Mongo, and I wanted to show you a piece of code that is actually quite cool. So if I go to, if I can find my, here we are. I don't always see my windows I'm working with here because they're all hidden behind all this stuff. Anyway, so I'm going to go into my class docs repository here. Hopefully I have pulled everything over. Oops, not here. It's going to be, oops, where would it be? 2000 pull, and here, class docs, git pull. Everything should be pulled over nice and neatly. If I go into my labs, or my lessons here, you'll find, for instance, week 11, which is where we are. And so we'll go into the sandbox. And inside here, there's a new file called Abstraction. So I wanted to take you through this abstraction file and kind of give you an idea about how to use it. Well, the abstraction, if you can see this, well, you should be able to see this. The abstraction file is it's another Pymongo, I guess what do you call it, a Mongo client. I guess that's what you could call these things. But basically, it is a program which uses a menu-based system to run, and it does all kinds of really cool things. But it's a menu system which allows you, the user, to work with a piece of, or a database in Mongo. And so I wanted to run this program and then take some time to actually talk to you about how this program runs. And then after that, we'll go into the practical, which I think will get done in no time at all. But the reason why I'm going through this piece of code is because we're going to be talking about our projects next week. And the projects next week are actually quite important because this is a way for you to kind of demonstrate that you know what's going on with, well, you know how to make a database and you know how to use a database and you can use it for something important. We'll talk about the actual details of the project next week. And I think that many people actually enjoy working with the database, or the database project here. But I wanted to give you these pieces of code here because you might find, for instance, that you need to use some kind of code system when you're working with your system, when you are putting your project together. Anyway, we'll talk about that later on. But I wanted just to give you this kind of this heads up so you know how the code is actually working. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this code that I have here, abstract. Oops. How is this? There we go. I'm going to copy my abstraction code into my Mongo data source directory. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I can't run this program unless I can see it inside my container. And so I have to copy it into this directory here. And I think that if you've been following the slides, then it's really the same. It's this part right here. It's really the same container directory for everybody. In fact, what did we talk about here? We actually talked about it somewhere here, right here. So if you created a directory that looks like this in Linux or Mac, or a directory that looks like this in Windows, you just have to copy your file there, and that's that. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run my container. I believe that it's already running inside my machine here. I just have to actually activate it or execute it. And so I copy that. I'll go back here. And I'm just going to go and paste that in there, and there, I'm in. So now after I have copied that file into my directory, remember that if you type in di or ls here, or yeah, ls, for a listing of files, you'll find, and hopefully you can see what I'm looking at here, but you'll find that right down here, there's this data directory. If you go to data directory, that data directory here, you'll find that there's another directory here called db. And you type in cd db, that will change directory into that. And then you find all these files which all make up your repository, or your database. But all these files are those files that are actually listed on your local machine. They're actually there on your local machine, including this directory that we made, I think, last Friday. And inside there, you'll find this file here called Abstraction. So it's all there. And so it's actually quite a, it's a hack, I guess you can call it. It's a hack. How can you get your source code into a container such that it's on your computer, but it's also you can actually see it in your container at the same time. And so it's a hack. Anyway, but let me just go ahead and run this first of all. Let me just give you an idea about what it's supposed to do. And to run it, you can type in Python, I think it's Python 3, or is it Python 3? And so you have this nice, neat, colorized menu. I added the color to all this just last night, otherwise from previous classes it was just black and white, but I'm hoping that the color helps you to kind of see what's what on the screen. And I find that color and software work together very, very well. Now, the first thing that I'm going to run is this 0 for DB information. Now, when I type in that, it gives me a bunch of crazy looking stuff here, which isn't very human readable. It's not human readable, but it's still information nonetheless that can be parsed out by software. What we see here is the host. So, for instance, this is your local host. Your Mongo client, although we don't have to worry about it here because we're working inside a container, the Mongo client actually works by using a server and a client. So you have a server that's kind of controlling the database and running everything. And then you have a client that runs kind of pieces of that, or that talks to that server and actually gets the information out that you want. So there's the client that talks to the person or the user or whatever it is that's interacting with the database. And then you actually have the database management system itself. And that's sitting at localhost 27017. And traditionally in the past, what you'd have to do is you'd have to get to this port in some way in order to get to that server. But because we're working in a container, the container does that for us, which is nice. Then we have some other information here, which is kind of interesting here. This is the TZ, this is time zone aware, document class, dictionary. It's like we have all this information here that the database needs to run. But the most important piece that we're looking at here is that we have this thing here called this agent. Agents is the actual name of the database which we're using by this code here. So in other words, this database is going to be creating an agents collection, I think it's called. And the employee is going to be is where the actual information is going to be, all the documents are going to be stored. So if I hit read, for instance, nothing will be there. But if I can go ahead and, I'll just show you a second. Let's just go ahead and add some information, and we'll see where it ends up. But we have agents and employee DB. But anyway, if I hit run here, it says enter the employee ID. And so I'll say my employee ID is 221B, that's his ID. His first name is, you guessed it, Sherlock, and his last name is Holmes. His age, I think he's probably about 20, he's kind of old, so I'll put him at 26. Enter the country, he's in the UK, and everything's done. So, although we don't see it, but this code here just sent all this information into our Mongo database. And we didn't have to do any coding, no programming, nothing. It just all happened seemingly magically for us. Now let's just go ahead and see that it actually did show up. And so if I push 3, it's going to run a query for us. And here we go. And this is the query. So now let me just go ahead and show you something here. Let's just add another name. I just want to show you I'll add another name here. Let's see the employee ID. This time is 007 James Bond. You know James Bond. His age, I think he's probably about 26. I don't know. Maybe he's also from UK. Just a coincidence. He doesn't actually know Sherlock Holmes. If you hit 3 here, for instance, you can read that the other guy has now been added. So now we have 2 references here. Now that's all very cool. Let me just go ahead and quit this for a second here and show you where this information actually showed up in our database. So if I exit this by hitting Q, I can type in Mongo, and here we are. And inside Mongo, I can just type in show DBS, and here we are. The DBS is called agents. That's where the code actually sent everything, and I'll talk about that in a second in the code when we review that. But if I type in use agents, then I can type in this next command, which is show collections, and then we have employee. So you can see that this information, agents and employee, this was information which was actually established by the code itself. So we have, it's a little bit different from how we're working with SQL, and that SQL just kind of like said, give me a file name, and I'll work with that. But here we have to actually specify what is the database and what is the collection that we're working with. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Let me just show you that we actually do have information in here. So if I type in DB, followed by, what's it called here, employee, find, you can see that the information that I just added by the software showed up here. In fact, let's do this pretty. And so you can see that everything kind of like all organized itself without me having to do any of this, including, for instance, that my object ID, or the primary key, for instance, is completely automated. I didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. It just does it automatically for me. I didn't have to worry about any of the, this is all done without me having to worry about a thing. Okay, so let me just go back to the code for a second. I'm going to type in exit, and I just wanted to take you through the code just to give you an idea, because when you're doing your own work with Mongo, you will probably find it very, 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 very handy to use Python when working with Mongo, just because. But I want you to see, though, that from today, that it is not incredibly difficult to make this thing happen. Okay, so using code, these are just some colors that I use. These are like the color codes that I have to use for print statements, so the colors come out as black, blue, cyan, white, red, yellow, green, purple, white. Those are the things. But actually, what I wanted to mention though is here is we have a client here. You have to tell Mongo. Actually, you have to tell the Python library where it can pick up the Mongo database, which is at this address right here, at that port 27017. But here's another thing here. This is the database. Remember that when we typed in show DBS, show databases, this is how we actually said this is the database that we're using. So you have to tell Mongo that you're using a specific database, you're setting up a database. And the reason why you do that is because one server can manage, seemingly any number of databases, and you just have to tell it which databases you're working with, and it will do it. It will handle it for you. It's like a library. It has many different books in there. You just go to the library and pick up the book that you're interested in reading. It's the same thing here. You just go to Mongo and have it, and then pick up the database that you're interested in working with, and that's this right here, agents. So you have that establishment over here. There's some other code that we'll talk about in a moment. And then at the very, very bottom here, we have to actually begin the code here by it's one of these functions here, if I can find it, right here. And so this is actually where we start dealing with our menu system. But there's something else I wanted to see here. These over here, these are actually very important libraries that we have to first of all load. And so, for instance, when we're loading, when we're working with our Pymongo system, you actually do have to tell it to install that library. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because in the past, when people have been working with Pymongo as code, if this line doesn't work, then that means that if the library hasn't been installed, in other words, then the code's not going to work. And one person spent, I think, an entire weekend trying to get something to run, but it didn't run in the end because they had not installed their library. So anyway, what I'm saying is that when you have these installs right here, when you're importing code into your software, or importing code into your source code, your own code, please do make sure that this is, you've actually installed this software here. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I believe that string is already that's just a part of Python, which I'm bringing in for some reason here. It must be. It's used in the code somewhere, but I'm not going to worry about that. But the other one, Pymongo, though, you do have to install that in order to import it into your code. I'm actually looking for something else that I wanted to talk about. I guess I'll just start with the menu system. Okay, so the menu system works this way, and that is that when you first of all, you have to give the user. This is basically just an elaborate print statement here. You have to tell the user, you ask them what they want. What do you want to do here? So you have this 0 for DB information, and then this is the part that actually changes the color, so you can see that color shows up. But 0, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, and the Q, these are all menu options that they can use. And because you have this while 1 here, it just circulates through these options until the user actually quits out, which is typing in Q. But let's just go through and see what happens when we type in info, and then we'll look at the other one when we do a read. But info, that's when 0. If selection, which is right there, here's the selection. When it's asking the user to enter something in, and that's what this input statement here does. And whatever the user has entered into the computer is then saved as selection. And so then we say if selection is equal to 0, then go to this function here called info. And so now, if we go down to info, it's right here. It's just this piece right here. It just runs that code when 0 is pushed. And so actually what it's doing is it's saying try db employee.db, which is actually the command you'd use to get some information about the employee database. Like, where does it come from? Where does it live? What's the port to access it? All that information is available here. This is actually code that you can type in fact, in your database, and it should work just fine. And so this is actually I think it returns a string, which is then held by result, and then result is then printed up by this statement down here. So really, it's just running code that you otherwise type in yourself into the MongoDB. The next thing here is this is all a try, just FYI. Here's a try and accept block. And what this is doing is that if there's any kind of trouble with this, then an error will not crash the code, but rather it will just print out saying database missing or something is wrong. That's what this would all do here. So it doesn't crash the code. It just says, okay, there's a problem. I'm not going to crash. I'm just going to go back to back to my system again. I'll keep the system stable, in other words. Anyway, that's all it does. It's very short. There's not much to it at all. The next menu item that we looked at just now was read database, which is menu option 3. And then when we typed in menu option 3, we get to this function here called read. And so what does read do? How does that work? Well, read is really similar to the code that we actually type in class. In fact, you'll recognize this right here. This is exactly the query that we type in, db.employee.find. And that is like giving you a whole rundown of all the documents in the collection that we're looking at. You can type that in and get the information yourself using Mongo. But here, you're just saying, Python, take care of this for me. So then you can just print everything out here. This is like you're able to kind of like, if you have a whole bunch of stuff there, you can iterate through it and print it out there. That will work just fine. And again, everything's inside this try and except block, because if something goes wrong here, then it could crash the Python program here, and that might you might lose data. That's why you don't want to crash this thing. You might lose data. And so we have this exception here, which means don't crash, just keep going, and then we'll exit out properly when we're ready. So this thing prevents your code from actually crashing. The next thing I wanted to talk about is going back to my menu, which is here. Let's see, if the user selects 4, that's a delete statement. So what happens down here? Well, if someone enters 4, then go to delete. And so then what does delete do? By the way, let me just talk about something else here. I have if, elif, 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 and then else. Now, you can't have like if, and then if, and then if, then if, then if, then if. You want to somehow have these all connected together. And I think that actually, if you're familiar with switches, like the switch command in Java or C++, I think this is like as close as you get to like that kind of code in this program. It's like a switch. And so we're saying either it's 0, if it's not 0, it's got to be 1, if it's not 1, it's got to be 2, if it's not 2, it's got to be 3, and then if it's not 3, it's got to be 4. If it's not 4, it's got to be Q. And if it's none of those, if it's none of these answers up here, then I'm just going to do this. It's like you have a kind of a switch here. That you're checking each of these things. But you're saying if none of those things actually fit, then it must be this. But these are all kind of selections that are in the same menu, if you will. And so in order to say that these are all like all options which are somehow together, which Python can go through and check, like one after the next. If it's not this, then I'll try this. If it's not that, I'll try this. If it's not that, I'll try this. I'll try this. Not that, I'll try that. And then if it isn't any of those, then I'll just print this thing out, which is really why you're using this thing here, so you can say, if it's none of those things, then just do this. But you would have if or else if. It's not if else, but it's else if or if. And so it's just a command that they use. There are other ways of writing this thing out, and so if you're looking at this wondering, why would they write this like this? Why would you need a menu that looks like this? There are other ways of writing this. This is just a way that seemed to be a good way at the time. It seemed like it was a good idea. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is like if you wanted to like actually delete something here in 4, how would I delete something? So then I think that's the drop. And so the deletes, actually what were we looking at before? Where is that? I think we were looking at something different before, but this is okay. Okay, so this is our delete statement here. What it's going to do is it's going to delete a document in the collection here. Now you do have this little line of code here. I wrote this thing out here just saying this will destroy a document, and it comes up in red text, so you can see that it's the user actually does wake up that if they use this command here, that what they do is they lose data. And you always want to tell people that they're going to lose data there because, well, it's a serious thing if you lose data. You can't get it back. Anyway, here, though, it asks you for the ID to delete. That's how it works. Now, this isn't the best way of doing this because when somebody is going to be erasing a file, maybe they don't want to be erasing a file according to employee ID, but maybe they want to erase it according to something else. And so you may have to think about programming that in your own code, so you can actually, you can actually find more ways of removing a document than just this. Maybe this isn't sufficient. Maybe this is actually not a very good system at all. But what it does here is that you type in the employee ID in this question. This is asking for the user input. Whatever the user types in goes here, and then employee ID is then sent over here, and that means that this command db employee.delete many means destroy all the records, or sorry, all the, I guess I should, the documents for which the ID is actually equal to this employee ID. Now, looking at this code here, I can already see that if somebody types in the wrong ID, there's no way of actually asking the user, are you sure that you want to do this? You can always add it, and if you're making this program for your own project, for your own use, you might want to add more security in here, saying, are you sure that you really want to do this? But otherwise, it just works. And then again, of course, if this code crashes, then, for instance, you have this exception to prevent the program from actually going down. That will bring down the whole computer. Another thing I wanted to talk about, though, is the update command here. And so if the user types in option 2, they can update their something that's in the database. And so what does the update command look like? Well, this gets a little bit more complicated, but actually it's not that much more complicated. What I'm saying is that we have done this before. In fact, we did this last class. Again, it says update a document in the collection. It needs to know an employee ID. It needs to know the first name and the last name and the age and the country. Basically, what it's saying is, give me all the information from the document. This is all the information that the document actually stores. The first and last name, the age, and the country, and the ID. And so what it's saying is that if you'd like to update this document, then just give me all the new information, and I'll just put it all over the old information. I'll just remove the old information and then put this new information in its place. And so this is not a great function if you just want to update just one particular piece of your database rather than updating everything. This updates everything, and in doing that, you can actually correct the stuff that you want to correct, but you have to correct everything at the same time. So if something stays the same, you just enter it the same way. But I want to actually show you the code that does that, and how do you actually update the record of the information with this new information. Well, again, you're using this command here called set, which we did in class on Friday, $set. And so what it does is it works very similar to a kind of a query here, where this first piece is saying, find that record or that document for which the employee ID is the ID that I'm looking for. And then in this block of code, it says here, change out whatever, if you find these things in there, or whether they're not there at all, but be sure to add this information to this document. Which means that if that document already contains like the first and last name and the age and the country of this employee, if that information is already there, then just go ahead and write over that information with the new information. However, if that information is not there, then add it. So for instance, if age, for instance, wasn't added already to this employee document, then age would be added by the $set command. Anyway, it's really as simple as that. It doesn't. There's no reason to overthink these things. This is exactly the same stuff that you and I would have typed in had we been working directly with the Mongo database. But now we don't type in these things because we have Python to type it in for us. And so Python actually makes things much more easy by just giving us these questions, like just simple questions saying, okay, what's the employee ID? What's the first name? What's the last name? What's the age? And then what's the country? And then we don't have to worry about typing in code, which makes it kind of really much easier, which is kind of nice. It's kind of nice. And so I think that's, although you'll have people out there who are like hardcore, hardcore Mongo people, and they'll say that we type in Mongo by hand, and we'd never use another machine to do this for us because the fun is actually typing in these commands. But actually, I was going to run this thing. But the thing is that I think it's one of those languages that really, it lends itself very easily to working with the software. And you might need that, actually, if you think about it, because Your MongoDB could be just this huge database which has a whole bunch of things going on in it. Anyway, so let me just go ahead and do my read again. You get all this read stuff here. If you were actually working with this, I mean, if this were like a professional program, your next step after you've run this command to read the database would be then to parse out this information here, to actually pull out the stuff that you want, and then to show it to the user in a more, I guess, readable way. If you have the delete function here, let's just go ahead and delete 007. Enter the employee ID to delete. Remember, we have there's a statement here saying this will destroy the document. And I can type in 007. I can say goodbye, Mr. Bond, and pushing enter, and he's gone. And I push 3 to get a readout. You can see that this has been updated. Anyway, I'll give you that. I'll let you play around with this code. I hope that it's useful. I hope actually you use it in some way for your own project, which I think you might. I mean, whether it's in this class or another class, you might find that you need a database. Well, now you have a menu-driven system in which you can use MongoDB. And another thing I can tell you is that if you look at this menu system, let me just go back here and have a look at this. But this menu system that we've been talking about has been written for Mongo, but that doesn't mean you couldn't somehow take the menu system out, something like this, or take out the theory or the ideas and apply it to a different database, like your SQLite database. You could have all these same functions actually not interacting with Mongo, but interacting with SQL. So anyway, that's just some food for thought. And so hopefully this will be useful to you in some way. Are there any questions over this at all? Does anyone have any questions over the code? If and when you do, well, I can be reached. You know how to reach me. Okay, let's go back to the slides, and I want to show you the practical. Now, let me just say something here. This is practical 4. These practicals are very important here. And I don't want you to forget to submit your practical, because the practicals do carry weight in your grade. And so I'm not very impressed with the practical 3 turnout. So I want you to be sure that you actually turn in this practical here. And remember how you do that? If you go to your sandbox, you'll find this directory here called practical, and there's a directory here called, or a file in this directory called queries. I want you to run this repository link here. Go there, and then once you've cloned this, you should already have cloned it. But I want you to actually copy this directory and this file into your repository so that when you push it, then all your settings will happen. I'll be able to see your settings. So let me just show you what I mean by that. I don't think I can click on this here, but let me just take you back to the file system itself. I have to get out of this. I'm going to go to this is my sandbox. And my sandbox contains this file 04. If I get in there, I have queries. I use my Vim here to show you what's inside the file. But basically, though, you have just some very basic, you have some queries that I want you to run or to analyze or to write or complete in MongoDB. And so here what I've done is I've given you the output of another query, and I want you to actually write in what was the query that gave me that. Give the query code to give me the following output from the employee collection. And what am I talking about for this employee collection here? This is actually the synthetic data small JSON file that we've already installed. In other words, it's that database that has all that crazy information about the names and the friends and the companies and the balance, all that information. That's this right here. But if you don't know which one that is, I can show you. It's this file right here, synthetic. It's this file. It's this data, which we have already put into our Mongo employee. Anyway, so what I'm saying though is that once you've finished writing or doing your code here, once you finish, or when you're working on this rather, not once you finish, but before you've worked on it, please copy this directory into your your practical repository. Yeah, for this class here. You just copy that in there, and then when you go to that practical repository, you can just run these commands where you can push everything up, and it should get in there, and I'll actually be able to find it. Okay, hopefully that helps. If I can click on the thing here and see what happens now. Can I sign into this and show you? Oh, I don't know. Well, anyway, you get the idea. But once you've gone inside this repository, go ahead and just shove everything you have in there, like all the code you're working on. Just put it in there, and then I should be able to get it when you push it up. So please have that done by the 11th here. This will, by doing this work here in your practical, this will really, really help you, I think, prepare for the exam. Please don't forget, many people forgot about sending in practical 3. I can't give you those points back. That practical is gone. But this practical is here. And so please go after practical 4 with the same energy that you normally go after your practicals with. Okay.